we're going to start with a quick poll, and you can just raise your hands if this applies to you. Have you ever been told that despite doing great work, you need to be more technical? Okay, that's good. So I asked this question because this is essentially at the crux of what we're going to be talking about today. Hi, folks. My name is Fatima, and today I'm going to be talking to you about how I sidestepped being glue. So a quick intro about me. I am based in Canada. I flew in just yesterday. I've just been sleeping since then, thanks to the jet lag. I work for a company called Yelp. If you're not familiar, Yelp basically publishes crowdsourced reviews for businesses. Earlier, our focus used to be a lot more on like restaurants and food and whatnot, but now we've expanded to like home services as well. So, you know, whether you're looking for a plumber, electrician, or just a nice place to eat out, Yelp is the platform to go to if you want to check out reviews and whatnot. I have an undergrad in math. I have a master's in data science, and ironically, I've been working as a software engineer throughout my full-time career. Just a disclaimer that I'm not representing Yelp or any of my previous employers here, and so any opinions or views expressed in this session are my personal opinions. Okay, so to set the stage, I'm going to start off with some context. I'll start by just quickly explaining what it is that I do at Yelp and sort of where my team fits in. So the team that I work on was created with a very specific use case in mind, which was to break up our monolith into microservices. So over the past 3 years, we've been working on a lot of these migration projects. Now, having done a couple of these migration projects, at least from my experience, what I think the challenging part about a migration is not actually moving the logic around, it's the rollout part, which is where, you know, there's a couple of key requirements that you need to ensure. One is obviously like the metrics, so metrics that are relevant to the business, like revenue, latencies, etc. They stay flat, or in the best case, they improve. And then lastly, you know, the end user experience stays the same. Now, the way through which we ensure parity, or the way through which we ensure that, you know, the metrics are staying flat is by doing some data analysis, and this is done through some Jupyter notebooks. Now, these Jupyter notebooks are not owned by my team; they're owned by stakeholder teams. So what we do is that we run these notebooks. We try to do some high-level interpretation, but the final decision as to whether or not the rollout is going successfully or not is done jointly with PMs and engineers from the stakeholder teams that I just mentioned. Now, this is what the rollout process looks like. Essentially, we start off as an A/B test, right? So you can imagine a migration is an A/B test. You have a status quo cohort. You have a treatment cohort. To minimize risk, you don't start off the experiment at like a 50-50 split. Between the cohorts, you start off at something like a 95-5 split, with 5% of your traffic going to the treatment cohort. We run the experiment, we run the notebooks, we share the results with stakeholders. Now, if the metrics are looking good, that's great. We can keep ramping up traffic until we've completely switched over all of our traffic to the treatment cohort. But if the metrics are not behaving as expected, that's where the challenge lies. Because that process of debugging can be, it's basically a hidden time sink. It can be pretty tedious. We basically have to eliminate all the potential sources of errors. So, you know, we ask ourselves questions like, okay, is the experiment setup correct? Is our migration introducing some bugs because of which metrics are being impacted? Did we do the analysis prematurely, you know, before the experiment reached statistical power? Or even, you know, if this amount of non-determinism is expected. So going back to this circle, yeah, this whole iteration can be pretty tedious, and it can take quite a while. In the best case scenario, maybe 1 to 2 months, but if things don't go well, this can take up to a quarter. Now, this process is a communication overload. Like I said, we're dealing with a lot of stakeholders, so you know, there's multiple Slack conversations. Yelp is fully remote, and you know, we have teams working across the world. So doing that, like that amount of communication, doing that in a distributed manner, if you've worked in a remote environment as well, can be pretty tedious because, you know, you're keeping track of multiple discussions. You need to make sure that, you know, you're following up across all these different threads that you've got going, getting approval. So it can be quite a bit. Now, where I come into the picture is that I was actually one of the first engineers on my team to run these notebooks and to basically execute that entire rollout process. So, I had the right context, I had all the right permissions to run those notebooks, and I had all the right contacts. I knew exactly who to reach out to when it came to those stakeholder teams. And then over time, because I ran this process enough times, I sort of became the default owner of this process, and I felt great. I felt so proud of myself. I felt that, I'm valued, even though I was like a junior engineer back then, but I felt that, okay, I'm such a pivotal member of the team, right? Anytime we need to do a rollout, I get to do it, right? So it was great for my visibility, both within my team and even outside of my team. I was sort of becoming the go-to person, simply because I was the one who would communicate so much with stakeholders. They sort of started associating projects with me, right? So anytime they would have a question about a project, it would end up being routed to me. So I felt great. So logically, at this point, you might be wondering, what's the problem, right? Everything sounds great, at least as far as my role is concerned within the team. The problem was twofold. One was that I was becoming a singular point of failure, right? Which is never good for a distributed system. It's not good for teams as well. Like I said, it boosted my confidence. It was great for my visibility, but I was also introducing significant risk when it came to the health and general functioning of my team. What if I went on PTO? What if I left the company, right? And more important than that, one day I come across this article titled "Being Glue" by an engineer by the name of Tanya Reilly, and alarm bells just went off in my head, and I'll explain why. Now, glue work, in Tanya's words, is the less glamorous and often less promotable work that needs to be done for the successful execution of projects. Now, examples include setting up meetings, taking notes during those meetings and then sharing them after for more transparency, talking to stakeholders, keeping documentation and project timelines up to date, and generally, improving processes within the team. So maybe you improve the onboarding process within your team. Maybe you're mentoring junior engineers. All of that are, great examples of glue work. Now, the caveat is that there is no denying that these tasks are absolutely essential to project success. You cannot, if you've ever successfully deployed a project to prod, you know that a certain amount of glue work is expected, right? And some amount of glue work is actually expected as a senior engineer. If you've recently interviewed for like senior or senior plus positions, you know that these are essential signals that an engineer is being assessed on. So this includes things like communication, collaboration, building consensus, etc. But the problem is that doing too much of glue work can be a double-edged sword because it's taking time away from you doing more technical work. And then during the next promotion cycle, going back to the poll that I shared at the very beginning, you'll basically be told something along the lines of, oh, you've done great work, but it just hasn't been technical enough. And that's legitimately one of the worst things that you can say to an engineer. So what is the goal that I have with this talk? And I set out to write this talk. I didn't just write it with the, keeping an engineer in mind. I sort of wanted to address the engineer, the manager, and the wider org. I think we all stand to learn something here. Starting with the engineer, obviously, like I've said, we need to be more mindful of striking a balance between the glue work and the more technical work that we do. So what I recommend here is that every quarter or so, take a step back and analyze your brag document. So for folks who are not familiar, a brag document is, essentially this personal document that you have where, for lack of a better word, you just dump every single thing that you're doing. Don't discriminate when it comes to adding things to your brag document. Don't get into the debate of, oh, this is not technical enough, this sounds too menial. Anything from you leading a major architectural change that, increased revenue by $1 million to you setting up meetings, add it to your brag document. What I recommend here is that please don't wait until your official performance evaluations to analyze your brag document. I recommend doing it a lot more frequently. And that's because, again, depending on how often or not your company does performance evaluations, it might be too late. Like if your company is doing performance evaluations once or twice a year, which can be pretty common, it'll already be too late by then, right? So my recommendation is that you do it I don't know, once every 2 weeks, once a month, or at the very least, every quarter. Next, speak up. And when I say speak up, I don't just mean advocating for yourself. I also mean advocating for other team members, right? So if you see someone, let's say you see another engineer on your team, and they always end up running meetings, right? You can be like, okay, how about we make this into like a rotational system, right? So that way, you're advocating for glue work being evenly distributed amongst team members, as opposed to the burden of that glue work being only on one engineer. And lastly, what I want to talk about here is that promotions have to do a lot with perception. Now, I know that perception, that can have somewhat of a negative connotation, and I get it, because it ends up making it sound very political, and it ends up making it sound like, oh, what you're doing is not all that important, but how you're projecting it is more important. And it kind of goes against everything we've been taught, our parents teach us, okay, what you need to do is to do good work, you need to work hard, and, you'll get the intended outcomes. And that's true, but I don't think that's like the complete picture, and I think this is one of the lessons that I learned once I started working full-time, is that not only do you need to do good work, but you also need to make sure that it's being presented to the right people, right? Which is why such an important process of getting promoted is knowing who the key players are. Is it your manager that has a say? Is it your skip level manager that gets to have a say? You need to know who the key players are, right? So that's where the perception also matters. So building the right perception is really important. And if you're doing a lot of glue work, your perception might not be what you were intending it to be, right? So let's say you're someone who volunteers on your team a lot to organize things, whether that's organizing documentation or meetings or team offsites. Because you're taking on so much of this glue work, over time, your perception might develop of someone who likes organizing things. Oh, here's Fatima, she likes organizing things. Is that the perception that I want of myself? Not really. Right? I want to be known as a competent engineer first. So that's what I mean when I talk about perception, but I'm going to come back to this to illustrate with an example. So I realized that I didn't finish my story as to what I did once I discovered that I was stuck in the trap of being glue. Obviously, the first thing was, when it hit me, when I read that article, but at the time, something that I sort of convinced myself of was that just because I've realized that, okay, I'm doing so much of this glue work, I simply just can't walk away from it, right? I can't be like, okay, moving forward, I'm not going to run the rollout process. You figure it out for yourself. You can't do that. Obviously, during that transitionary period, you want to make sure that, the team continues to function. The next thing that I did was that I talked to a mentor within the company, and the mentor actually helped me realize something really important, which was that a big reason as to why the burden of running the rollout process might be on me is because roles aren't well defined within my team. So each of these migration projects would have a project lead, but the project lead role wasn't all that well defined. For the life of me, I didn't know how the project lead role is different from any other engineer who's working on that migration project, right? So that's an issue right there. Roles need to be better defined. And lastly, to sort of move out of that role of being the only person running the rollout process, I started doing some knowledge sharing. I trained my team to run those notebooks. Ironically enough, I wrote a lot of documentation. But the good thing is that since I've now trained the team, after that initial documentation that I wrote, I've never had to update the documentation. The team members have now started doing it. What do I do now? So now, if a task comes up, and I know that, okay, this is glue work, I resist the urge to volunteer. So very recently, we have a team offsite coming up. And I brought it up to my manager in one of our one-on-ones. I was like, okay, we have this team offsite coming up. Let's, we can start to plan it. And he was like, yeah, that's a great idea. Feel free to lead it. I just had to bite my tongue to not be like, okay, yeah, I'll lead it. I was like, no, okay, just take a step back, and I opened it up to the rest of my team. I went into our team Slack channel, and I just posted, okay, does anyone want to do this with me or take the lead here? So yeah, you have to be mindful, and you have to resist the urge to volunteer anything glue comes up. And then secondly, like I said, going back to the question of like, how do you build perception? So I do a lot of public speaking, both in like a personal capacity and, on behalf of Yelp. That's something that, my team is aware of. That's something that my manager is aware of as well. But I don't want my perception to be just of Fatima who does public speaking, right? Again, like I said, first and foremost, I want to be known as Fatima, a competent engineer. So recently, in a team meeting, there's a public speaking initiative that we've started internally within the company that I'm a part of. So during a recent team meeting, I shared that public speaking initiative. But in the same meeting, I also led a discussion with regards to some architectural changes that we needed to work on. So, and I know that's a very small example, right? But you don't build perception overnight. It's these little examples that are contributing towards the perception that exists of you within your team. So that's exactly what you need to be mindful of. Next, the manager. So as the manager, obviously, you want to be watchful of your team falling into the trap of glue work. So an example that has always really stood out to me, and back then, I didn't realize the wisdom behind it, but now that I understand what glue work is, I appreciate it a lot more. So when our team was just getting started, my manager, on purpose, he set up a rotational system when it came to leading meetings or taking meeting notes. And that's a fantastic example of preventing the burden of glue work from being assigned to just one engineer, right? You distribute it amongst your team members. And then secondly, encouraging greater knowledge sharing. This whole journey this personal journey that I've walked you through, my manager had a big part to play in this journey. He was actually one of the people who helped me realize that, okay, I'm becoming a singular point of failure here. Next, as we talked about before, defining roles clearly. I know, titles can mean different things across different teams, but it is your job as the manager to define them clearly. Like I said, it shouldn't be, there shouldn't be a situation within the team where there is a project lead role, but it's not clear how the project lead role is different from any other engineer who's working on the same project. And lastly, explaining the weight of different contributions to the promotion process. I think that's a very, very important one. I think that's something that a lot of engineers might not have a good understanding of. We look at the, again, every company does it differently, but you look at that chart and it says that, okay, here are the 5 different components that we assess you on when it comes to you getting promoted. But you might not know this, but not each of those 5 components might have an equal weight, right? Most companies will assign a greater weight to the technical work that you're doing compared to the non-technical work. So as the manager, if you want to avoid a situation where, an engineer is asking you, okay, I've clearly done great work, you've said so yourself, why did I not get promoted? If you want to avoid awkward situations like that, you want to make sure that you're, explaining the weight of the different contributions as it relates to the promotion process. And lastly, the org. So obviously, I don't think it needs to be said, but there needs to be more holistic performance evaluations. As we've talked about, glue work matters. It's like launching projects successfully requires more than just your technical prowess. So it's not like just the number of commits that an engineer is making is not a good metric of a good engineer, right? There is a certain amount of glue work that the role will require. So the org needs to do a better job of making performance evaluations a lot more holistic. Okay, so just to review, we talked about a couple of different things. So we talked about what glue work is. We talked about why it's needed. We talked about why it can be a trap. And then lastly, we talked about what the engineer can do, what the manager can do, and what the wider org can do when it comes to helping their engineers, like preventing them from being stuck in the trap of glue work. Okay, I realize we have a bit of time left, so I'm happy to stay back for any questions. But yeah, thank you for attending my talk, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions in the audience or online? There's a question. I see you.
Thanks a lot. I mean, you were touching a really important topic. I mean, I'm working in a really big organization, so and still I feel most of the things are valid everywhere. One of the important things that I think you touched was this perception, and I guess that's exactly the point that most of engineers struggle. And as you said, I mean, we value more the work that we do and the things that we build, and not the presentation. I mean, what are, I mean, some additional recommendation you have how to make the important things visible in a way that still we don't feel, oh, I'm showing up myself or something like that. I mean, some people still feel guilty when showing up the things that they've done, which actually they shouldn't, I would say. But yeah, what are your recommendations in that regard? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when it comes to advocating for yourself, like my recommendation is that do it unabashedly. I don't think humility serves much here. So I'll just give you an example. I remember for one of these migration projects, we were stuck, and we'd been stuck for a couple of weeks. Again, we were working with all of these stakeholder teams, and we just, like, the conversation just kept going around in circles. And again, if you worked remotely, you know that happens more often than what you would like. And I think it had been 2-3 weeks of just us going around in circles, not reaching any conclusion. So I was like, okay, I'm like, forget about the Slack conversations. I'm going to put a quick meeting together to, like, so we can agree on something and move forward. So that's a great example of me doing glue work, right? But then when it came to my one-on-ones with my manager, I made it a point to mention that. I was like, okay, and one, I made it a point to mention that because that's easily something that could have slipped right through the cracks. And then secondly, I think you always need to quantify the glue work that you're doing. So it's one thing to say, oh, I set up this meeting to unblock us. It's another thing to say, we'd been stuck on this for 2 to 3 weeks, but I set up a meeting and, we resolved it. We were able to move forward, right? So I think, like, yeah, it might be difficult to tie it back to the business objectives and whatnot, but the moment you assign some sort of quantity to it, you quantify it, I think people take the glue work a lot more seriously. Any other questions?
Thank you. I wonder how the role of a mentor at Yelp is and the role of your manager, because for me, I would expect that the manager helps me.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So you mentioned that you went actually to a mentor.
Yeah.
And that was obviously not your manager.
Yeah.
And I wonder, why is this like 2 roles or like 2 different people? Because I expect that the manager actually does mentoring you.
Yeah. No, that's true. It's just because I was scared. I've never been in this situation before. Like I said, I was like a junior engineer back then. So I was new to Yelp. I'd never been in this situation before. And I was like, I don't know how to bring this up. I don't know what's the right way of approaching this situation. So yeah, I think it was just a matter of comfort. But for sure, like once I went to my manager after, I got the right mentorship there as well. But I think it was just a matter of ease, yeah, or comfort.
I have one question from the community online. Would you say there's a strong gender component on being perceived as glue?
Oh God, yes, absolutely. You know what's so funny? I've been submitting this talk to a lot of conferences, and one conference, I think they accepted it, but the feedback they gave me was like, because this was something that I would write out in the proposal, that, oh, when it comes to glue work, underrepresented, communities, minorities, women might be, they might be volunteering a lot more to do this glue work. There's actually research behind it. And they recommended that, oh, maybe you take this part out. But yes, there absolutely is a very big gender component to glue work.
Okay, then we have a question here.
The question is, do you think are there some situations in which some hidden technical work might be considered glue work?
Hidden technical work. That's a tough one. Honestly, this scenario that I shared, like it depends on how you define technical work, right? Like, so going back to this cycle here, this one, right? So you know the debugging part here? I mean, I would consider that a pretty technical thing to do, right? But again, I think once you put it in the context of the whole rollout process, you would be more inclined to think that, oh no, this is like more glue work as opposed to technical work. Yeah.
But I would consider that.
Exactly, right? Yeah, exactly. But see, that's, again, going back to the perception thing that I was talking to you about. It's about how, like, if I were to describe this process as, oh, this was just me communicating with stakeholders, versus saying, no, this was me communicating with stakeholders, but I also debugged why the metrics were, you know, why there was a degradation in metrics. There's a difference between those two things, right? So that's where, again, the projection and the perception part also comes in.
Hey, so you've mentioned that you've created documentation in order to help your team do the work for you. Have you had to convince them to do it for you? Because I know that software developers in general are not likely to write documentation. And I fell into the trap where I started doing documentation to help them. Yeah. And then nobody wanted to update it besides me.
Absolutely. And I think that's where your manager can be your biggest advocate. So then I had to like rope in my manager, be like, okay, I've done this, but no one's updating it. So please, can you help me? So then, yeah, I think that's where you want to leverage, you know, your manager to encourage wider team contributions. Yes.
Any more questions online or here?
I also want to say one more thing that I want to add to that. I think it's also important to like learn to give up control and to delegate. I think that's another very important part of this process. I think to a certain extent, I also became very attached to running this rollout process. And then, you know, you want things done a certain way. But I think to make that transition to glue work being adequately distributed amongst the team, I think you also need to give up a little bit of control and be like, okay, this might not be up to my standards, but just let it be. You know, the people will learn over time.
Okay, we have another question from online. Why does this seem to be more of a North American issue? This need to showcase and overstate what you do.
Oh God, I don't know if I want to be a spokesperson for North American culture right now. Maybe because the culture might be more political than other cultures. Again, I don't want to. Please don't quote me on this, or yeah, but it is. And again, I very strongly dislike saying it that way, but I mean, it is true. It is political to a certain extent.
Okay, I think there was another question over there.
Hi, thank you for the talk. So I was wondering about the Bragg document you were mentioning. How, like, I'm curious about that. How do you structure it? How do you advise doing that? Because it's something that I don't do, for example. And like, is there any advice you want to give us?
Again, I'm going to attribute these things to the right people. The Bragg document concept, I think, search up Julia Evans. I think she's a former Stripe engineer. So she was the one who actually came up with this term. And I think there's a blog that she wrote, and it has great recommendations on how to structure it. Honestly, for me, it's always a tug of war for me, because I'm always tempted to like, oh, just keep dumping whatever it is that I'm doing. And then when it comes to the performance evaluation, I'll put it in like the right categories and whatnot. But yeah, honestly, the Bragg document, like I said, it's yours. So structure it however you think helps you the most. And then, yeah, before, you talk to your manager, you can always, move things around. But it's yours. Whatever helps you in terms of recalling what you've done the most. Yeah, that version works.
Yeah, my question is, you said you're working remotely, right? So do you think that makes a big difference in also visibility? You don't get the everyday visibility just like by people walking up or something like that?
That's a great question. I don't know. I don't want to say that. I I don't think so, because again, you know, even like I have worked in person before the pandemic. I think ultimately it's about, I think like, I'm sure we all know so many great engineers who, again, despite doing great work, they don't get the visibility that they deserve, right? So I really don't think that it's about whether you're working remotely or not. Yeah, that's what I would say. I do think that, yes, for sure. I think when you're working remotely, I do think you have to make a little bit of extra effort to get that visibility. But for sure, I can, like, you know, I can think of so many engineers that I worked with back when we were in person, and they don't get the visibility that they deserve. Yeah.
Any more questions? Then, thank you very much, and give another round of applause.